So today we're going to be thinking about the work of Jacques Derrida, the famous French post-structuralist and semiotician. To be honest, of all the theorists we'll be looking at in this course, Derrida is definitely among the most peripheral to my own areas of expertise. And this isn't saying at all that he's not important, it's not saying that he's not worth engaging with, but it means that I'm not quite as confident speaking with authority on his thought as with some of the other theorists that we've discussed. But nevertheless, bear with me. I'm going to do my best to try to express my understanding of his ideas. And so this, the fact that I don't really engage much with Derrida in my own work is one reason why I'll stick fairly closely to the primary reading for this week. The other reason I'll be doing that, of course, is that I think it's actually an exceptionally clear explanation of the thought of someone who's a famously difficult philosopher. So we could do a lot worse than to follow that reading quite closely. So as usual, we'll be looking a bit at Derrida's life. Then we'll discuss some of his key ideas. So we'll discuss the idea of deconstruction, we'll discuss the idea of legitimacy and the law, and we'll look at his concept of moral and political responsibility. So Derrida is a French post-structuralist, but he was actually born in Algeria, a French colony, in 1930. Algeria now is, of course, an independent nation, but during Derrida's childhood, France was actively trying to turn Algeria into not just a French colony, but actually a proper part of France itself. Of course, this didn't mean that Algerian citizens of the time were treated equally with the French. In fact, while French settlers had full French citizenship, Muslim Algerians certainly didn't. Derrida, though, he was a Sephardic Jew, and he did have French citizenship. So Derrida attended primary school in Algeria, then started in the lycée, the public secondary school, in 1941. However, at this time France was occupied by Germany. Now France at this time infamously rounded up Jewish French citizens and handed them over to the Germans, who moved them to concentration camps. And while Algeria was never occupied, as the French mainland was, nevertheless the French government, in the treaty it signed with Germany, agreed that the German racial order would extend to France as well. And so Derrida, being Jewish, was expelled from the lycée in Algeria. He was also subjected to physical and verbal violence. After being kicked out of the lycée, Derrida began to attend a Jewish high school, but he didn't really feel comfortable there, and he barely turned up. He was able to return to the lycée in 1943, but he didn't do all that well there and failed his baccalaureate, basically his university entrance exam, in 1947, perhaps because his goal was to become a professional footballer, as you can see in this photo. But he did finally pass his baccalaureate in 1948, and he enrolled in the École Normale Supérieure, which at the time was the leading institute for literature and philosophy in the French-speaking world. So at the ENS, he made friends with Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault, both of whom are pretty important, and Foucault, of course, is someone who we'll look at after the break, and is one of the most cited authors of all time. Althusser we're not looking at in this course, but he was hugely important as well, particularly in France, and invented what's called structural Marxism, which tried to emphasize the scientific elements of Marx's thought. He was also the teacher of Jacques Rancière, who we look at in the last week of the course, and who was also actually a French Algerian. Now Derrida passed his aggregation, which is kind of a high-level teaching qualification, in 1956, and after military service in the Algerian War of Independence, he began teaching at a lycée in Le Mans, which is a city in France, and then he was appointed to ENS in 1964, and he stayed there for about 20 years, at which time he moved to the École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales, or the School for the Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, which was based in Paris. Derrida, he's a thinker who's pretty famous. He's very well known outside the academic world.
And he's actually become part of popular culture, including being the subject of a song, as the primary reading mentioned. He's also had a huge influence on the art world, and in fact he's himself been engaged in organizing art exhibitions. He was also very politically active, and he supported dissident intellectuals in Czechoslovakia. He was even imprisoned by the Czechoslovakian authorities in 1981 on entirely trumped up drug charges after participating in a secret seminar. Finally died in 2004, so not all that long ago. But one thing to flag with Derrida is that his thought has been quite controversial. It hasn't always gained acceptance in the academic world. And in particular, he's often derided by analytic or Anglo-American philosophers, and is taken to be kind of an exemplar of the continental side of the so-called analytic continental divide in philosophy. So for the analytics, he kind of epitomizes exactly what's wrong in their view with continental philosophy. So while he did receive a honorary degree from Cambridge in 1992, this was highly and kind of unusually controversial. Now I want to caution you a bit. Derrida is famously difficult. He's not an easy philosopher to read at all, and he doesn't try to make things easy for you. But I think in making Derrida kind of a bogeyman representing everything analytic philosophers don't like about continental philosophy, they end up kind of treating him like a bit of a straw person. So they caricature his thought, and then they attack this caricature. And fairly often their acquaintance themselves with Derrida's work is second-hand to be charitable. So they often rely on the fact that kind of everybody knows that Derrida's work is nonsense, but typically show little to no understanding of what that work actually is. So I think the cartoon I've put up here, which I won't read out, but you can see it on the slides later if you want, kind of captures this kind of way of thinking about Derrida. So I want to caution you up front against this view. He's not someone that I personally engage with in my own work, but I nevertheless think he's someone who we need to take seriously, who we need to think about. Now, one of the reasons that Derrida is so difficult to read for many people is his view of language, because for him, language can never capture reality. There's always something missing when you use language, any language, and never fully describes the thing that you're referring to. So language itself, as used by Derrida, is always going to fall short of expressing the philosophical ideas that he wants to put across. And he doesn't pretend otherwise. He's pretty open about this. So in his work, then, Derrida deconstructs language and meaning. He shows the lack of meaning in language. But of course, he's showing the lack of meaning in language using language, right? Which is an odd thing to do. And again, this is something that he's perfectly aware of doing. And because of this, Derrida's work often has a kind of a jokey air to it. It's serious work, there's no question about that. But at the same time, it does kind of make fun of itself because it's criticizing something, but it's doing so using the very thing that it's criticizing. So it's criticizing language, but it's using language to criticize language. So it's never really capable of taking itself overly seriously. Derrida also comes up with a lot of new words, and we'll look at some of them today. But again, the difficulty with reading Derrida and the difference between Derrida and the typical theorist who coins new terms, because I'm sure we've come across heaps of new terms so far in this course, is that Derrida's arguments are actually challenging to language itself. Right? So he needs new words not just to express new concepts, which is again a pretty commonplace thing, but also to develop an entirely new way of thinking that gets around the fact that language itself is inadequate to explain his ideas. So for this reason, it's often thought to be the case that reading secondary material on Derrida, or having someone like me explain Derrida to you, is just not an adequate way of getting at his ideas. It's not just that Derrida is better at explaining his own ideas than I am, but rather it's the fact that Derrida's texts themselves perform rather than express his ideas. So in other words, he doesn't explain what, for example, deconstruction means in his work. He doesn't offer the system of theses that we usually find in academic writing. And we can read these and we can say, oh, I understand exactly what Derrida is talking about now. He doesn't do that. It can't possibly work that way for him because the whole point is that his ideas can't be captured with language itself. So you can't just set out these ideas in a clear and a straightforward kind of way. We can't just say, so we start with this concept, and then we derive this idea from that concept, and so on and so forth, because that is using language, and Derrida thinks language is inadequate. So instead, as I said, his texts are a performance. They perform this deconstruction, and through this close engagement with this performance, we can start to appreciate the logic of deconstruction in practice. So explanations are never going to be enough for Derrida. We need this performance if we're really going to understand what it is that he's really about. However, I haven't actually set any primary texts on Derrida in this course. All the primary, secondary, supplementary readings, they're all secondary sources. I think it would be overly mean to set you primary texts on Derrida. And we just don't have the kind of time in this course for a really close, careful reading of Derrida that would be necessary to get anything out of his primary sources, because we're looking at 20 theorists in 10 weeks, which is a lot. But that doesn't mean that this close engagement isn't important. And so just keep in mind that the secondary sources, and of course my lecture as well, they're always going to be second best to actually reading Derrida himself. So if you do decide to write on Derrida for your essay or for the exam, it's worth hunting down some primary sources and trying to engage with them. Okay, so let's think about his most famous idea, the idea of deconstruction. So I've mentioned already, of course, that deconstruction relates to language. So the thing being deconstructed in this case is language itself. And this works by unsettling the categories on which our thinking is based. And the categories that are also kind of fundamental to language itself. As I said before, because of this, you can't really express what deconstruction is very easily in language, because then, of course, you'd be using the thing that's being deconstructed in order to explain what deconstruction is, and that would be a little bit odd. But we're using language here. That's all we can do, so we'll do the best we can. Now, one of the really central ideas for deconstruction is that Western thought is structured in a particular way. So he thinks that we fundamentally think in terms of dichotomies. So a dichotomy, I'm sure you've come across the term before. It's a pair of terms, a pair of concepts that are opposites of one another. Or at least Derrida thinks they appear to be opposites of one another. And I think that's fairly obvious given a moment's reflection. So we have light, for example. What's the opposite of light? It's a really easy one. What's the opposite of light? Darkness, yep, absolutely. So we've got dark. What's the opposite of obvious? Obscure, yep, something like that. Ambiguous, like all synonyms like that. Different. Same, yep. Kind. Nice, yep. Or cruel, sorry. And I think that this works through IR as well. This is something that goes through all these IR terms that we use. So we've got domestic. What's the opposite of domestic? International, yep. Opposite of sovereign. Come on. Subordinate, citizens or subjects, yeah. Opposite of power. Doesn't have to be the exact word that I've got up here, but it's a synonym, as long as you're getting the right idea. So you had something, yeah? So Well, power as it's typically used in IR. Come on. Powerless? Yeah. Or impotence, right, exactly. Anarchy, order, yep. War, peace, yep. Zero sum, absolute gains, or positive sum, yep. So these are all, all these dichotomies that run through international relations. They're pretty clearly pretty fundamental dichotomies. What might some other examples be in international relations? Can you think of any other dichotomies that that we've used in this course so far? Yeah. Yeah, like knowledge and ignorance. Yep, absolutely. Yep. I mean, I'll ask a more difficult question. Can anyone think of a term in IR that is not part of a dichotomy? A concept that doesn't have an opposite? It's pretty challenging, right? It's very difficult to do. So one of the key ideas of dichotomies, Derrida points out, is that the two members of the dichotomy are mutually exclusive, right? So to the extent that something is light, it's not dark, right? To the extent that something is powerful, it's not impotent. To the extent that we have anarchy, we lack order. So that's the first important thing. The second important thing is that it's pretty clear that the terms of the dichotomies are not independent of one another. So you can't make sense of the idea of light without the idea of dark and vice versa, right? The concept international only makes sense in relation to the idea of the domestic. We only know what anarchy is if we have an idea of what we mean by order. And we can only make sense of order so long as we know what anarchy is. Right? We can't understand peace and war without each other. If we don't know what we mean by either of those terms, then we can't make sense of the other one. A sovereign implies a subject, and a subject implies a sovereign, and so on. We could just keep doing this all day. So according to Derrida, then, we always conceive of the world in terms of these dichotomies. And importantly, in these dichotomies, the terms are mutually implicated. And he thinks the fact that we conceive of the world in terms of these dichotomies is not some idle thing. He thinks it's a really significant thing, a really important part of how we relate to the world. And he thinks, in particular, it's a problematic part of how we relate to the world. So for one thing, he thinks that the terms of the dichotomies are actually not equal. There's always a hierarchical relationship between the terms, between the concepts in a dichotomy. One is always more important, one is always more essential, one is always better than the other term. And I think this is, again, pretty clear if we think about the dichotomies we just discussed. And I'm like 100% sure there's going to be universal agreement here on the ranking of these concepts. So, hands up, which is better, which is more fundamental, which is more essential. Who thinks it's light? Who thinks it's dark? One person? Well, not 100% agreement then. But I think, yeah, obvious or ambiguous, which is better. So obvious, ambiguous. That's a very puzzling one. I'm not sure where that one comes from. Okay, well, that's not what I would have thought. So we'll discuss that in tutorial because I'm very confused there. How about different and same? So who thinks different is the more fundamental term? Who thinks same is the more fundamental term? Yeah, this is more disagreement than I would have thought. This is quite interesting. How about kind and cruel? Which is better? Kindness? Cruelty? No one? Good. That's good. Domestic? Who thinks domestic? Who thinks international? Okay, again, more people saying international. Who thinks sovereign? Who thinks subject? Okay, that is exactly the opposite of what I thought, so that's another one worth discussing. How about power? Impotence? No? Yep, that one's pretty clear. Anarchy? Order? Yep, that's pretty clear there. War? peace. Yep. Zero sum, positive sum. All right, on most of those, fewer than I thought, but on most of those, there's basically agreement about which ones are better, which ones are more important. So Derrida points out that dichotomies always contain these hierarchies. One of the terms is always privileged over the other term. And Derrida suggests that a second term in each pair is considered the negative or the corrupt or the undesirable version of the first. So, you know, dark is undesirable, the corrupt, the fallen, the negative version of light, you know, ambiguous, obvious, and so on, right? Now, Derrida is really interested in a certain dichotomy that he thinks underlies Western thought generally. He thinks that the dichotomy of presence and absence is a particularly important one for how we think about the world. So of these two, which would you say is more fundamental? Presence? Absence? Yeah, so pretty clear agreement on that one. Clearly presence, I think. So absence is sort of the negative, it's the undesirable version of presence. And for Derrida, one of the places where this dichotomy and the hierarchy that this dichotomy embodies is most interesting, he thinks, is in terms of the dichotomy between speech and writing. So speech and writing, he thinks, correspond to, in a large degree at least, to presence and absence. So speech, he thinks, is primary and authentic, whereas writing is corrupt and derivative. And this may not be immediately obvious, but think of it in this way. Writing is further removed from what it is that's being communicated, right? So that's why, you know, you're all here in this room. I could design a course in which you all just only read, right? But that wouldn't be seen to be as good a course. If all you did in this course was read and there were no lectures, you'd probably complain about that, right? I hope anyway. So in speaking, I can try to explain these ideas to you. And if you don't get what I'm saying, then you can put your hand up and you can ask me to clarify the ideas, and I can have another go and I can talk about it in a different way, right? And the reason why that's possible is because we're all present in the same place. We're present. Another example is, say, if I wrote an email. Let's say it's possible that I can write an email to you and something in my email would offend you. And now, of course, I wouldn't be intending to offend you. And maybe even a good example of this was Gareth Morgan's recent comments, right? Lipstick on a pig with Jacinda Ardern. Now, from his point of view, and I'm not fully backing him here, but he would say that the problem was the uncertainty in the communication. So it was a tweet, like he wrote this thing down, and because of this, the nature of the communication was uncertain. So the offense from his point of view is that he wasn't able to clarify what it is that he was saying. But if we're all present together, then that kind of problem doesn't arise, or it doesn't grow too much, because if I say something that you take to be offensive and you say, "That's horrible, Michael, why are you saying that?" And then I can say, "Oh, no, that's not at all what I meant. This is what I meant," right? So in this sense, speech is better than writing. Speech is more clear than writing. Speech is present, and writing isn't present. Or speech takes place in presence, and writing doesn't take place in presence. Now, there's no question, of course, that speech is not great for a lot of things, because it does require that we're all together in the same place. It requires that we're co-present, and this just isn't always possible. But this is the ideal, we think. For communication, we take speech to be the ideal. We take being together in the same place and talking to be the ideal form of communication. So we think that speech allows us to get closer to that perfect form of communication. Now, we can never get all the way there, but generally speaking, I think we take it to be the closest that we can do, closest we can get to this perfect communication is through speech, is through speaking to each other. So this idea that speech is the closest to our thoughts is the idea on which Western culture relies in Derrida's view. So the privileging of speech over writing, he argues, ties into our privileging of presence over absence, right? Because we have this idea of foundations, we have this idea of origins, this presence at the root of communication, right? So when we express ourselves, we show something that's present in our thoughts. The thing that we present is rooted in our thoughts. When we communicate, we try to make clear what our thoughts are. We reveal our thoughts. We express our thoughts. These are all terms that bring to mind the idea of presence, right? There's something present that I'm trying to reveal to you. So they all disclose this concept of origins, of foundations, the idea that there's something present that we disclose in our communications. And Derrida thinks this is why writing isn't as good as speech, or why we take writing to be not as good as speech. Because speech represents our thoughts, it represents the presence, the root, the foundation of our thoughts, and writing then represents speech, right? So writing is one step further removed from presence than speech is, right? So our speech represents our thoughts, writing represents our speech. So that's an extra step. Now this way of thinking is what Derrida calls logocentrism. Well, yeah, that should have been up there a long time ago. He calls logocentrism, or logos, which means reason or speech. And so the idea that our thinking is based on the presence of something in our expressions is this idea of logocentrism. Now, I think we can see the privileging of presence over absence pretty clearly on the whole when we look at the dichotomies that we considered earlier. So we could say, why is light better than dark? Well, darkness is the absence of light, right? Light is present in the case of light, light is absent in the case of dark. Something's obvious, that means a clear meaning is present. If it's ambiguous, then a clear meaning is absent. Difference is the absence of something in common between two different things. So difference isn't a presence. What makes something different from something is this lack, right? They lack sameness. Cruelty, I think it's pretty clearly, cruelty is a lack of kindness. To be kind is to think about other people, to have particular desires, particular character traits, such as empathy, such as compassion. And to be cruel is to lack these things. International and domestic maybe is a little bit trickier. I would probably say, international, we have connotations of freedom, of movement, whereas domestic is the absence, the lack of these things, the limitation of these things. The sovereign, they're defined by having absolute authority, by having authority present. The subject lacks this authority. Impotence, that's not something present in itself, that's the lack of power, the absence of power. Anarchy, the absence of order, it's not something that's present, it's defined by what's missing. Peace, and I think especially if we follow Kant here, is this particular state of affairs between people. And war is when that state of affairs breaks down, when we lose that state of affairs, when that state of affairs is absent from our relations. Positive sum, is when something is created by an exchange where there's a gain is present, and zero sum is where a gain is absent. So zero sum is characterized by this absence. So I think it's pretty clear that all these terms embody this metaphysics of presence over absence. For Derrida, though, this way of thinking is just a mistake. We shouldn't privilege presence over absence in the way that we typically do, because he thinks we can't do so, even if our whole way of thinking is based around the presumption that we can do so. Now, in order to illustrate why he thinks this is such an impossibility, the primary reading discusses the flight of an arrow, because he thinks we can't think of the movement of an arrow as purely a matter of presence, right? Because at any time, right, the arrow is present in a particular location. So at time 1, the arrow is here. At time 2, the arrow is there. At either time 1 or time 2, can you see the arrow in movement? So time 1 or time 2, can you see the arrow moving at either of those times? No, you can't, right? Why? Why can't you do that? It's going too fast? Well, it's not going at all in this case, right? Like the arrow is present here, and it's present there, but the presence doesn't give you the movement. Present, in fact, makes it impossible to think of it in terms of movement if all you care about is presence. Because all you have is where the arrow is at time 1 and where the arrow is at time 2. So any time the arrow is fully present at a particular location. And if we think of things in terms of presence, then by paying attention to where the arrow is, or is present, we lose the ability to understand the arrow as something that's moving. So in order to appreciate the arrow as something that's moving, we need to think about the arrow's past and the arrow's future. We need to think, okay, so the arrow at time 2 is here, but at time 1 it was over there. Right? So this is no longer talking about the arrow's presence. So the fact of no longer being there, the fact of being absent, is actually an essential fact about the arrow if we want to think of it in terms of its movement. So similarly, we need to think the arrow is present here now, but soon the arrow is going to be over there. Right? So we need to think not just where the arrow is present, but also where the arrow is absent from. And we could flip this around as well. We could say we're interested in movement, and we could say the arrow is absent from here, and it's absent from here, and it's absent from here, and it's absent from here. But that actually doesn't give us movement either, just talking about absences, because we can't know just where the arrow is not. Like any given arrow is absent from pretty much everywhere, right? But that doesn't tell you what its movement is. So, this arrow is absent from the moon, but that's not actually a useful thing in terms of understanding the arrow's movement. So we can't just focus on absence, and we can't just focus on presence. So if we want to understand movement then, we need to know where the arrow is present now and where it was present before, but is now absent from. So we need both absence and presence. So movement requires us to have what we might call absent presence. We need to know not just where the arrow is, but also where it's not. But we also kind of need present absence. We can't just know where it's not if we want to understand movement. We need to know specifically which absences are present, right? Which are relevant to understanding this particular thing's movement. Because not all absences are present. Some absences, I know this is getting confusing, but some absences are just absent. Like being on the moon, that's an absent absence, right? But the absence of the arrow at time 1, that's kind of a present absence. That's relevant to understanding the movement. Whew, okay, any questions there? Because this is kind of a tricky idea. Yeah, all good? We'll keep going? Yep. Yep, but you can't privilege one, I guess would be the point, right? You can't say that presence is all that matters or absence is that all that matters. It's this kind of weird relationship between the two. Yeah, and that's sort of what he wants to say. So he thinks that when we examine presence and absence closely, this dichotomy, this idea deconstructs. It's shown to be an impossible dichotomy on the basis of the very presuppositions that are necessary to it. So we think it's useful in the world, turns out to be incredibly not useful. Okay, now, as applied to speech and writing, Derrida argues that actually these two things are not all that different from each other. We think of them as a dichotomy, perhaps, but in fact they have a lot in common. So Derrida says that speech and writing are both a form of what he calls systems of writing in general. And so in this way he just deconstructs this dichotomy as well. So deconstruction as a way of approaching a text then involves this kind of inversion, this kind of displacement. So inversion, of course, means the flipping around the terms of the dichotomy. So we do this. So we say, what would it mean for absence to be more important, more fundamental than presence? What would it mean for darkness to be more fundamental than light? What would it mean for light to be secondary, for light to be derivative of darkness? What would it mean for ambiguity to be more important than clarity? So in international relations, we could think about things like, what if we flipped sovereign and subject around? What if subject was fundamental and sovereign was seen as the less important, the derivative thing? Or what if impotence was more important than power? Or anarchy is like the base, and order is just this degraded form of anarchy. So I think already this method of deconstruction perhaps gives us a different way of conceptualizing things. But he thinks just inversion in and of itself is not enough. We don't actually move too far from where we began if all we're doing is inverting the terms. And he thinks as well that the political possibilities of this move are quite limited. So to illustrate this, the reading gives the example of masculinity versus femininity. So traditionally in Western thought, the dichotomy was conceptualized with masculinity at the top. So femininity, by contrast, was, it was seen as a lack. It was, of course, a straightforward physiological lack, but also a lack in other ways. So, masculinity, it was associated with the idea of thinking rationally, of deciding objectively, avoiding being influenced by the emotions. And femininity, by contrast, was a lack of rationality. It was a lack of objectivity. It was sort of a very subjective way of being. It was domination by one's emotions, and so on. So one obvious move that we might want to do here, if we want to oppose this way of thinking, is to invert the dichotomy, right? So what would it mean if we put femininity at the top, and if we put masculinity underneath? And that can have important consequences. So if we think about things in this way, then we might say the feminine ability to live emotionally is the good thing, and masculinity is conceptualized as a lack of the ability to live in an emotional kind of way. So in this case, masculine rationality is not this positive thing that leads to feminine emotionality. Rather, it's saying feminine emotionality is primary, and when that's taken away, when that's degraded, then the residue afterwards is masculine rationality. And I think, to a limited extent, this kind of inversion can be useful. There's a kind of potential in flipping things around in this way, because at the very least it shows the arbitrariness of the previous way of structuring things. So it's not necessarily that we want to say that this is a great way of doing things or that it's meaningful, but it's actually pointing out how arbitrary the previous hierarchical structure was. So it seemed obvious for a long time to many people that emotion was a lack of rationality, and that rationality was a good thing. So thinking instead of rationality as a lack of emotionality, and perhaps as a degraded, less good way of being, gets us to think about these ideas in a slightly different way. But this can only take us so far, because if we're doing just this inversion, we're not actually overturning this basic way of thinking. So inversion, it swaps the terms around, but it maintains basically the same relationship between those terms. So inversion, for example, it reproduces a way of thinking in which feminine can be strictly delimited from masculine, right? And because of this, this inversion remains within the original system of thought. And this original hierarchy, masculine on the top and feminine on the bottom, is therefore always a possibility. The basic way of thinking remains the same, and it can always reassert itself in changing circumstances, this original structure. So Derrida thinks while inversion is a really essential first step in order to trouble these dichotomies, we need to do much more than this. So we need to not just invert the dichotomy, but we need to displace the dichotomy. So we need to move beyond the previous system of thought by questioning whether the two terms of that dichotomy are really as distinct as we originally thought they were. So perhaps in the case of masculinity and femininity, we would ask, can masculine really be thought of as separate from and as opposed to femininity to begin with? So we break down the assumption that these two terms in this dichotomy are actually in opposition, that they're these two entirely discrete, separate categories. So Derrida wants us to question then whether the terms of the dichotomy are actually mutually exclusive. Now Derrida makes the same move with speech and writing as well. So first we break down the obviousness of the dichotomy, he thinks, by inverting it. So what would it mean if writing were primary and speech were derivative? Then once we've unsettled this dichotomy, we can take the extra step of displacement. So what if rather than being distinct and discrete, both writing and speech are simply a form of the same activity? He thinks inversion is this really important first step, but it's just not enough by itself. We also need to shatter the dichotomy entirely with the further step of displacement, by seeing that the two terms, they actually mutually permeate. They're not these completely separate, completely distinct things that mutually exclude each other, as we previously thought. Now the reading discusses a couple more concepts that are quite important to deconstruction. It discusses the idea of difference and the supplement. We don't really have time to go into them here, but maybe we can discuss them as best as I'm capable of doing so in tutorials. But instead I want to move on to some ways we might apply this process of deconstruction to international relations. So Zafus, the author of the primary reading, points out that deconstruction is pretty clearly a political activity. So as in the case of masculinity and femininity, it's a process by which we can basically explode the basic concepts by which we engage with and make sense of the world. And this is going to have some pretty drastic political consequences. If we approach international relations from the perspective of deconstruction, then we're just going to need to reconsider a lot of what we previously took for granted in terms of the very words, the very concepts that we use to make sense of international affairs. Now, one way that this has been applied by Derrida is through his analysis of just and unjust force. And this is pretty clearly, I think, a dichotomy, just and unjust force. So we have the idea that some violence is just, in the sense that it's backed by some legitimate activity of the state. And other violence is unjust. It's private violence, it's violence that doesn't have a legitimate authority behind it. So we might think of unjust violence as kind of the degraded, the absent form of violence. The justness of it is absent. So in just violence, legitimacy, that's present in the violence. But in private violence, this legitimacy is absent. It's not there. It's unregulated violence. So in other words, we have the force of law, the violence that's permissible because it's backed by law. And he thinks, after all, law that isn't backed in principle by violence isn't law at all. And then we have this unjust, unlawful violence. So we have authority, we have law, we have legitimate force, we have justice on the one hand, and we have unjust, we have illegitimate, we have unlawful violence on the other hand. And Derrida, what he wants to do is he wants to deconstruct this dichotomy. And he does so by thinking about the source of law, the legitimacy of law. Where does this legitimacy originally come from, he asks. Well, he thinks this legitimacy has to come originally from violence. Now, this can be actual physical violence. So, of course, the US Declaration of Independence, that led to the War of Independence, which was pretty violent. But he thinks it doesn't have to be violence in this really direct, this really obvious kind of way. He thinks the Declaration of Independence itself was a violent act. It asserted, law is this, law is not that, and law applies to these people and it doesn't apply to those people. Right? And it said these people are welcome here, those people are not welcome here. We could say exactly the same kind of thing about New Zealand. Putting aside the physical violence in New Zealand's history, of which there's a lot, even the very first assertion of British sovereignty in New Zealand was a violent act. It set down law, it set down rules about who could do what, it set down what legitimate relations were possible between peoples. It set out who was included and who was excluded. It said these people, New Zealanders, and these people have rights, and these people are not, and they can't come here and they don't have rights, unless we give them permission. So it sets out what it means to be a New Zealander under the law. And these are all violent acts, Derrida thinks. These are interpretive violence. Because, one thing to remember is, again, law is not law unless it's backed by force. So something like the treaty in New Zealand is not just setting out rules and concepts and understandings. It's also making certain kinds of force legitimate and certain kinds of force illegitimate. And itself as well, it's bringing into existence the violence of law. Now, what does it mean then in terms of the dichotomies of law and violence, or justice and injustice, or legitimacy and illegitimacy? What's the application here? Well, Derrida wants to ask, was this initial act of interpretive violence legitimate or illegitimate? Right? Was it unjust or was it just? Well, what would you say? Yep. Maybe. It's difficult to say, right? Like, it's a really difficult thing to say. And I think Derrida wants to say this originary violence, it wasn't actually legitimate or illegitimate. It wasn't either of those things. It can't possibly be legitimate or just, as you say, because legitimacy and justice rely on law. And there was no law preceding this act of interpretive violence that would make this initial founding act of the law just or legitimate. On the other hand, it isn't illegitimate or illegal either, because you require a legitimate authority before something becomes illegitimate. And you require law before something becomes illegal. So this originary violence was neither just nor was it unjust. It was neither lawful nor was it unlawful. It wasn't legitimate and it wasn't illegitimate. So Derrida thinks anytime we use the law, anytime we rely on the law, we're bound up with this original moment of violence, the original moment that's neither just or unjust. And he thinks, for Derrida, this gives us a concept of law and a concept of violence that just doesn't have any ground to it. Further than this, Derrida wants to examine the concept of law and justice. And we usually take them to be the same, right? We usually take them to be at least clearly related, at least part of the same group. we say something being lawful is pretty closely connected to its being just. And this discussion of justice or the justice of the original moment of law is pretty suggestive, I think, of this connection. But Derrida points out that they're also profoundly different. And they're different because law is calculable. And he thinks justice is not calculable. Justice is a singular act. So we can determine whether something is lawful or not by just applying the existing rules. We can calculate the legality of any particular action. And that's just how the law works, right? Something is either legal or it's illegal. And that depends on whether it's permitted by or forbidden by the existing law. Derrida thinks this is just not possible when it comes to justice. The question of justice, he thinks, arises specifically when rules don't actually deliver a clear outcome. So we might have, for example, two different laws in tension with each other. This is not an uncommon occurrence. Our laws were built, piece by piece over time, and they're not going to be this completely consistent set. And in such a case, when these laws are in tension, when the correct outcome is not completely clear, the question of justice arises. So justice, for Derrida, is an act of deciding in a particular case. It's a decision made in a situation that's not ensured by a rule or by the law. So because of this, Derrida calls justice an experience of the impossible that can only take place when a decision is made freely. And a free decision is one that he says goes through an aporia, this unresolvable internal contradiction. It's an aporia of the undecidable. So the undecidable, he thinks, is just this matter of giving oneself up to an impossible decision. And of course, both rules or both principles are legitimate. So this is a matter of genuine tension. When we're in this aporia of the undecidable, we have two genuine conflicting obligations, and we don't have guidance. We need to decide what we're going to do. Now, what this means is that no decision can ever be fully just, because this undecidable, this remains in every decision that we make, or every real decision that we make. So if you choose to follow one rule or one principle, one law, one moral ideal, then you don't follow the other one. But Derrida points out the other, the law or the principle or whatever, that was also legitimate. It also had a legitimate claim on us. So in deciding one thing, we're also ignoring another thing. And so we can't say that our decision is entirely just. And he thinks this is exactly the same in ethics. So you have let's say you have a choice. You can give money to charity to help someone in a developing country, or you can, buy your child school books. What do? Who would give money to charity? Who would buy something for their children, buy the school books for their children? Who doesn't know at this stage? Yeah, okay, there's still some people there. But it's difficult, right? If you do one of these things, you don't do the other thing. Like, the basic idea is you choose one, which means you don't do the other. But the other choice still has a legitimate claim on you. So your decision, no matter what decision you make, can never be fully just. And I think this is a perfect example recently in New Zealand politics. So Metiria Ture told the public that she lied to her work and income, which meant she broke the law, to feed her child. And Derrida would say this is a perfect example of an undecidable decision. So the law, it makes legitimate demands on us. We have an obligation perhaps to uphold the legal order. But on the other hand, we also have an obligation to provide food and comfort to our child, and that is a legitimate claim, a legitimate demand on us. So no matter what we choose, the decision is going to be both just and unjust at the same time. It's this dilemma you cannot actually get out of. No matter what you choose, you're going to be committing some kind of wrong. If she'd chosen to not lie, to uphold the law, she would have been failing in her obligations to her children. She chose her children, so she failed in her obligations to the law. No matter what decision she could possibly have made, she would have been acting unjustly. So for Derrida, moral and political responsibility rests on this aporia of the undecidable. If you're just mechanically applying rules, either laws or moral principles, then he thinks you're not deciding. If you're not deciding, you're not responsible. You're not taking responsibility for what you're doing. We're out of time. Okay. Almost done. So responsibility in decisions in international relations then arises when different groups have legitimate claims on us. So we can think perhaps of this in terms of the responsibility to protect. Now we can codify responsibility to protect in law and in a certain ethical framework. We have these moral justifications for responsibility to protect. But if we just apply this framework to the world, we're not taking responsibility for our actions. We can only be said to be taking responsibility if we make a genuine decision, if we recognize that there are different, irreconcilable claims on our action in this case. So if we just say, look, sovereignty isn't important because of this moral or legal principle, then we're actually missing something important, because we ought to respect sovereignty. At the same time, perhaps we ought to help people who are in trouble, right? So to pretend that this is this easy decision, that one decision or another, one option or another, is pre-decided because of law or morality, is to miss something really important about the case. It's to refuse to actually take responsibility for our actions, to actually take responsibility for the decision that we make. Rather then, Derrida thinks that we need to approach these kind of decisions with this acknowledgement that there is a genuine decision to be made, and that no matter what we choose, our decision is never going to be fully just. Now, at the same time, we have to make a decision. We can't abrogate our responsibility to make a decision. So just because this decision is undecidable, this doesn't mean we can just throw up our hands and walk away. So acting responsibility in the case of responsibility to protect, it's not a matter of doing good or doing evil. It's a matter of negotiating this really difficult situation in which there is just no perfect, no purely good, no purely just way of going forward. So I guess in this way, Derrida deconstructs the idea or the dichotomy of justice and injustice, or the dichotomy of good and evil, because in practice, no real decision that we ever make is going to be one or the other. It's always going to be this mix of both of these things. Okay, I want to finish there then. On Thursday, we'll look at Jean Baudrillard, who is pretty crazy. You may have come